Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This morning, Holly shared with us a passage from the prophet Ezekiel. He's not a guy who's heard from often in church, for prophets are a strange bunch. There's a reason we don't often preach on them. No one likes them. They tell us things we don't want to hear. They make us uncomfortable. They tell us we're going to have to change. Biblical prophets were always being run out of town or beat up or thrown into wells. See, the problem with prophets is they're just so intense. But in their defense, they often have good reason to be. You rarely see a prophet standing on a soapbox yelling, "Everything is just great, people, you all relax." They tend to appear in times of crisis and catastrophe. And this was definitely the case with Ezekiel. As biblical scholar and theologian Eugene Peterson tells us, Ezekiel was speaking to the Israelites who had just been captured by the Babylonian Empire and taken into exile and slavery. Their world had fallen apart, and everything that they once knew and loved was gone. Now, when catastrophe strikes, people respond in various ways, but primarily the response falls into two camps: denial and despair. There is one group that simply refuses to admit that the catastrophe is real. They shut their eyes tight and pretend all is fine. They take refuge in distractions and lies fantasies. And then the other group, the despair people, are paralyzed by the event. They cannot move past it, and so they throw up their hands in surrender, closing their eyes to the world and believing all hope to be lost. Now, when it comes to biblical prophets, Ezekiel is the master at dealing with catastrophe. He was surrounded by people who stubbornly refused to see what was right before their eyes, the denial crowd. And then there were those who were unwilling to see anything but the catastrophe, the despair crowd. I found myself drawn to the writings of Ezekiel as I was reflecting on the sermon theme this morning, for I think that we have much in common with our ancient Israelite ancestors, especially when it comes to dealing with catastrophes. For the next several weeks, we are exploring the wonders of creation and our relationship to it. And we are holding these conversations in church because our relationship to creation says much about our relationship with God. As part of this conversation, we cannot escape the fact that this poetically named luminous web is being significantly frayed by our human agenda, our patterns of consumption and production and waste and abuse. What started as subtle imbalances have now become major disasters as we experience wildly distorted weather patterns, superstorms, droughts, floods, and the domino effect of melting ice caps and rising sea levels. The catastrophe we are experiencing is not a sudden one. In fact, we've been warned about it for decades, but we've ignored the warnings, either out of denial or despair, or a refusal to change our convenient and profitable habits. But now it has moved into a new phase. The crisis is no longer a prediction. It is upon us, and we have to decide how to respond. One of the modern prophets of the environmental justice movement is Bill McKibben. With his first book, The End of Nature, which he wrote in 1989, Bill began a career dedicated to telling us just what is at stake from our human-centered agenda. Since that first book, he's gone on to write dozens more, has received the Gandhi Prize and the Thomas Merton Prize, has honorary degrees from 18 colleges and universities, and has gone on to found 350.org, a grassroots global climate movement that is now active in 188 countries around the world. Foreign Policy magazine named him in their first list of 100 most important global thinkers, and the Boston Globe called him America's most important environmentalist. And yet, when I Googled him to get more information, one of the posts that came up first was, "Bill McKibben is a fraud." I followed that thread, and I found a number of postings, mostly from independent blogs, smearing his agenda and his credentials. And there's nothing really surprising about that. If you're going to dare to speak truth to power, if you're going to tell people inconvenient truths about the state of our environment, if you're going to tell people that they're going to have to change, you're going to get some pushback. I wonder if Ezekiel had his own version of internet trolls. Early in his career, McKibben began a quest to understand just how we as a culture got to the point of this climate crisis. And so he went out, and at the time, which was probably 20 years ago, he found the largest television system in the whole world, which at the time was in Fairfax, Virginia, and it had 100 channels. Can you imagine all those channels? He got people in Fairfax to tape everything that came across those 100 channels, and he took it to his home back in the Adirondacks, and he viewed all of it. Roughly 2,000 hours of programming. The message, he writes, distilled to its essence, which comes through that television all the time, is simple. You are the most important thing on earth, the heaviest object in the known universe. If you had to pick one message that was most effective for building a huge, strong economy, that would probably be it. And it has worked wonders. We have consumed and produced and raised our standard of living in ways that no one in any previous time or place could have imagined. But, he continues, if you want to create a message that is profoundly troubling from a spiritual point of view, and one that has made progress on issues of great importance, especially the environment, very difficult, you couldn't have picked a better one than you are the most important thing on earth, the center of the planet. This is an old question. Where do we stand in relation to everything else? In fact, it might be the oldest question, for it shows up as the centerpiece of the oldest book in the Bible, which is not Genesis, but another prophetic book, the book of Job. You may remember the story of Job, a prosperous man, a good man who always did his bit for his community, for his family, who was faithful to God. Job was upstanding in every way. Then one day, it all changes, and his life becomes a series of curses. First, he loses his property, then his family, then his health, and at last he is sitting on a heap of ashes, covered in festering boils. As one might do in just such a situation, Job begins to wonder what in the hell he did to deserve what has happened to him. His friends come by, and they spout all kinds of religious cliches and orthodoxy, essentially blaming him for his troubles because God must be punishing him for something. This was the standard party line in Job's day, and it may sound pretty familiar to all of us as well. But Job would have none of it. He knows he did not bring this on himself, and so he begins arguing with God. He demands that God justify himself. And God puts up with this litany of accusations for several verses, and then replies out of a whirlwind, I've heard you out. Are you ready to listen to me now? And then God really lays into him. You have a problem with how the world works? Where were you when I laid the whole thing out? Were you there when Earth's foundations were poured or when the stars were set in the sky? Do you know how to stop the waves from breaking or where they should go? Do you know where the lightning is launched from or where I keep the hail and snow? Do you know how to teach a hawk to fly or the lion cub to hunt prey? And on and on and on. It's a frightening and beautiful piece of writing. Beautiful because it lays out the complexity and interconnection of the world in a profoundly powerful way. Frightening because from God's perspective, we are clearly not the center of it. God sees the world through very different lenses than we do. Human justice and creation justice are not always the same thing. God is God of all creation, not just of us, which is a very hard thing for us to hear. In the passage from Ezekiel, God takes it a step further. Not only are we just a part of the web of creation, we've been overstepping our bounds in ways that are causing great harm. Ezekiel uses the metaphor of self-serving shepherds to describe the kind of leaders who take advantage of the vulnerable, who use up the resources around them, but don't replenish or nourish those resources. He calls them to task for placing greed above their responsibility. He indicts them for abusing and polluting and overrunning the pastures. Aren't you satisfied to feed in good pasture without taking over the whole place? Can't you be satisfied to drink the clear stream without muddying the water with your feet? Why do the rest of my sheep have to make do with grass that is trampled down and water that's been muddied? And here is where I find the connection for us in our catastrophe today. For we know that it has been our poor leadership, our culture of greed, our unwillingness to do with less so that others can have enough that has led to the environmental crisis we now find ourselves in. We have not been satisfied to feed just in our section of the pasture, but have taken over the whole field. With only 5% of the world's population, the U.S. emits 25% of greenhouse gases, the main factor in global warming and climate change. It is our affluent lifestyle that overwhelmingly contributes to the problem. Now, we might call it a contributing factor, but Prophet Bill McKibben calls it a crime. And he doesn't mean metaphorically. For as frightening as our changing weather patterns have been here, we are the least vulnerable to its effects. A drought in the U.S., for example, may cause crop prices to rise and make it less possible to have fresh tomatoes in January. But a drought in other parts of the world means starvation and disease and death. We are exporting the damaging results of our lifestyle to folks who live closest to the margins. I can't even begin to outline in a sermon the real impact of our production and consumption. But I do strongly encourage you to read Bill McKibben's work on the subject, among many others, particularly the work of his organization, 350.org. Now, the number 350 means climate safety. For to preserve a livable planet, scientists tell us we must reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from its current level to the level of 350 parts per million. That is the threshold that our atmosphere can stand before it begins to trigger a series of environmental events that will change our ecosystem forever. Right now, we've already passed that. We are at 400 parts per million, and we have unleashed changes whose future implications we are only now beginning to see. Now, it is really hard to talk about this subject without becoming an apocalyptic prophet ourselves. For the time has passed for half measures. The scientists have done a tremendous job in alerting us to the dangers, but our political leaders have failed us. They have fallen into the camp of denial, choosing to believe reports funded by petrochemical companies rather than the hard science. They've chosen to reward their highest donors with watered-down legislation or blocked new policies altogether. And what is most disappointing is our religious leaders who have allowed their relationship with economic interests to get in the way of their prophetic responsibility, who have placed bad, human-centered theology above the theology which protects creation as an act of faithfulness to God. So where are we in this response? Are we deniers too? Or have we fallen into despair, throwing up our hands and refusing to believe that anything can change? Our prophet Ezekiel offers us a third way through, a way of looking for God in the catastrophe, a way of partnering with God to bring hope out of the destruction. Because even though the Israelites were blinded by denial and despair, Ezekiel saw. He saw what the people couldn't or wouldn't. He saw God at work. He showed them that this catastrophe was real, and while God did not create it, she was present within it, using it to bring new possibilities to light. How can God use a catastrophe? By waking us up to new ways of being, ways that will save us. During the crisis in Babylon, the Israelites learned that they could adapt, they could succeed, and they could still be God's people even without their temple, even without their homeland. They were more than that. And out of their struggle, they created a new identity, a lasting identity. For us, this environmental catastrophe can teach us that there are new ways of powering our planet, new ways of living in community, of sharing our resources, new ways of relating to the earth that will save us. If we have eyes to see, we can find God at work in this time, waking us up to new connections, inspiring innovation, using this catastrophe to help us become the people she has called us to be. This afternoon, thousands and thousands of ordinary people from all over the country, in fact, from all over the planet, will be converging on Midtown Manhattan to be a part of that wake-up call, to hold our leaders accountable for making hard, good decisions about the health of the whole planet, not just their little corner of it. And they need to hear from us. So this morning, I invite all of us to be prophets for creation, to be heralds of change. It is not just an act of justice. It is also an act of hope and an act of faith, for we must move beyond denial and despair into action. We do believe that God is at work, even in disaster, but it is our hearts and our hands and our voices that show it to the world. Amen.